Hello everyone, it's Tony here from Lockster Reads on the last official day of Remembrance Reads. I just thought I'd take you through what I have finished in the last couple of days. Now, although this is the last official day of Remembrance Reads, I will continue tomorrow and finish one of the books that I am about 50% through, because I'm doing an interview tomorrow evening with the author of that book, hopefully, if all things go well. So I'm about, actually slightly more than 50, I'm probably about 60% through David Jones' Engraver, Soldier, Painter, Poet. That's a reread by Thomas Dilworth. That's a reread. I probably won't do any more reading today because I have been absolutely hammering the reading today, and I think I've run out of energy. So, what did I finish? I finished Greatcoat, a self-portrait of David Jones in his letters, edited by Rene, Hague or Hague. I will find out tomorrow, hopefully, how that's actually pronounced. I'm going to say Hague because I think it's Hague. Anyway, this is a collection of letters, as it says. They're actually really interesting. I find David Jones has a very interesting approach to art and literature that I think makes it where he sees man as a making animal, and that making art or making useless but beautiful things is a key part of what humankind is. And there's almost sacred. He's a Catholic, and there's a religious element to him, thinking that all the art has a sacred element to it. And it's a really interesting read about sort of that outlines some of his philosophy about art and music and literature, and how he approaches it. But it also talks about his struggles with his mental health, his struggles with the work, with creativity, with finding ways to get things done that he wants to get done. He seems to have been in some respects not difficult in the sense of being unpleasant. He seems to have been a very nice man, and he had a group of very loving friends who helped bail him out constantly financially. But I think he was difficult in the sense that he was struggling with issues that mentally he was confronting. Now, Rene Hague said David Jones had a breakdown in the mid 1930s after a rush of work where he completed like 60 paintings, wrote in parenthesis, but then he had a nervous breakdown, and other people put that down to sort of the late impact of shell shock. David Jones spent more time on the front line than probably any poet or writer of the first, certainly English writer of the first, well, British writer. He beat me around the head for calling him English. Writer of the First World War. I think somewhere, I can't remember which book it was mentioned it. I think they worked out it was 117 weeks on the front line. That's bound to have an effect on you. But Hague says that David Jones's sort of view of the war was not positive, but it wasn't. He never talked about it as if it was the worst thing that happened to him. I'm not entirely convinced by that. I think that it's got to have some effect on you, and maybe a bit like Ivor Gurney, pre-existing tendency towards unwell mental health was exacerbated by the effects of war. In Ivor Gurney's case, he had a complete collapse and ended his life in an asylum. That didn't happen to David Jones. He sort of kept himself going, but I think that's partly because he had such a massive support network of supporters. Whereas Ivor Gurney, I think, had some, but they weren't. It wasn't quite the same. And also, as I said, Ivor Gurney's pre-existing mental health issues were probably more severe than David Jones's. I really enjoyed reading this though because his ideas are fascinating. His writing is interesting. It's all about. There's lots of discussion about ideas and influences or not. Actually, there's a chunk of this book which is about basically uh, his annoyance at people um, telling, picking out influences on him that he says are blatantly not influences on him, and missing ones where he was clearly influenced by them from his point of view, but that people don't spot it. Um, so he sort of gives literary criticism the occasional kicking because he discusses that whole idea of where people get their influences from over and over again in this letter collection, and it's actually one of the more interesting threads throughout. But yeah, I really enjoyed that. I mean, it's obviously a book for people that it's not a book. I don't think you can, as a general readership thing, you have to have a specific interest in write. I think if you're interested in creativity and art, I think it's definitely worth reading. And obviously, if you're interested in David Jones, but this one I think is a bit more specific. The other book I finished, which I can't recommend enough, was Blindfold and Alone: British Military Executions in the Great War by Cathryn Corns and John Hughes-Wilson, published in 2001. This is a superb book. It covers a subject that is difficult in a very clear and specific way. It goes back to the paperwork, it goes back to evidence, it goes back to back to the facts, to discuss the process that led to people being executed. As I did in the previous video, there were actually only 300 and something executions in the British Army in World War One, which is only 10% of those people who were condemned to be executed. The book makes it clear that in a lot of cases, those people were on their second or third death sentence, effectively. The other ones have been remitted. They were encouraged to be remitted because people didn't want to generals didn't want to waste manpower by shooting people. They wanted to shoot other people. Was it Patton's line? Is it the thing about warfare is not to die for your country but to make the other bastard die for his. So there was an attempt, and also they tended to punish NCOs and officers hard. Like NCOs, if there was one incident in here, I can't remember the actual numbers, but there were a couple of NCOs and about 5 private soldiers, and the 2 NCOs got executed and the 5 privates did not. It was desertion, I think. But it goes through the different types of crimes. 37 of the people shot were shot for murder, which was a capital crime in the UK at the time. Anyway, and they would have been executed. They would have been hung at home had they committed the same crimes. It does make clear, though, that there were issues there in terms of perhaps some people were executed when they were suffering from shell shock, and they probably deserved to be let off. And there is truth that sometimes men were shot to set an example. The regular British Army did not have faith in the conscripted new army soldiers entirely, and I think occasionally, particularly if a regiment had a reputation for being not properly under control, men were shot, and on another day, perhaps they wouldn't have been. But it's not arbitrary. It's not General Melchett executing Blackadder for killing Speckled Jim. There was a whole process, and by the standards of the military law of the time, and by the standards of the understanding of mental health of the time, it was done the best way possible. You had to go through the death. If somebody was sentenced to death by a court martial, they had to go through a process. It had to be signed off by, I think it comes to about 5 more senior officers, and the final one to sign it off would be the head, the senior officer in the battle, the region, whatever the proper word is that I've forgotten of that area. So Hague sometimes, but in Gallipoli it would be a different officer. And Hague, they remitted 89% of the death sentences. Basically, in a lot of cases, they were shot for repeated offences. Now, were they always... What happened after the World War is this was all changed, and I think in 1922 they changed the war rules so that... And actually this book does a very good job of... the first third of it is contextualising what's about to happen. So it talks through the history and development of military law in the 1914, mental health in Britain in 1914, the shock of battle, shell shock, a brief history, shell shock of the Great War, and military law in action. So that's part one. Then part two is actual specific cases that goes through to, and it covers the different kinds of offences for which he was shot. It talks about the possibility that boys under the age of 18, let's call them, were shot. Although that's hard to prove. There's probably one case where he almost certainly was, but they were only But what comes across in those cases is nobody ever said, "Oh, it wasn't me, I didn't do it." They mostly said, "Yeah, I did do it, but there were reasons why I did it," or they said, "Oh, they just." So there were no wrong. There were no people wrong. The wrong person was chosen, or the wrong. It seems to have been quite. And the army, the rank and file, seem to have accepted that this was what happened. There are cases though where it wasn't perfect, and then the final section is it talks about there's the consequences during the war, sort of parliamentary debates, then something called the Darling Committee, and then post-war views on shell shock. And there was something called the Southborough Committee, which reviewed all the medical stuff about what they'd learned about shell shock, and made recommendations based on that. That was a quite deep discussion. The Darling Committee was about the death penalty in the military, and then what happened was they removed the death penalty from everything except for treachery and what was the other one? Murder and treachery, basically. I'm sure there's another one, but you weren't going to get shot after I think 1922. You weren't going to get shot for desertion, for anything else, basically, which some senior officers in World War II were a bit annoyed about, because there were circumstances where they felt that they needed to shoot some deserters to discourage others from doing it. But as the book says, the actual desertion rate in World War II was tiny, because in a lot of cases, where are you going to go? If you're in North Africa, where are you going to go? So it's a very comprehensive history, and obviously now I don't think there are death penalty in the military is in place for anything, because I think we've obviously scrapped the death penalty full stop in the UK, and I don't think even there are any death penalty things even for the army now. Although that might obviously change if we are ever involved in a large scale war again, that it needs people to be called and conscripted. But I'm not entirely convinced even then. So that's what this book. So I really recommend this book if you want a really comprehensive discussion of something that you hear a lot about, and it comes with a lot of understandable emotional baggage. I recommend this book. Seriously recommend this book. And there you go. That, barring me finishing the David Jones biography, and a later video that will come of the interview that I'm doing tomorrow evening, if that all goes according to plan, is the end of Remembrance Reads. I hope you found it interesting. I hope you are encouraged to read some of this stuff yourself. I've learned some lessons from this one for next year. I think I'm going to make World War One reading more of a part of the year as I go on, so that Remembrance Reads I could talk about other books and then talk about some specific books in the actual month itself, and maybe theme the month. I'm tempted at this point to read to talk about the start of World War One next year. But it does seem that obviously next year is going to be the anniversary of the Battle of the Somme. So maybe something on, maybe a more Somme focused. I will think about it. I've got a year to think it through. Obviously, December is tomorrow, and December in my manor in this house always starts with me listening to Tom Baker's reading of A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens on December the 1st. I listen to this all the way through. It's 3 hours on the 1st December. I love this, partly because I love Tom Baker. So tomorrow, with the exception of finishing the last World War One book I'm reading at the moment, we're into Christmas, and I can dig out all the Christmas stuff. Not that I have much Christmas stuff. And I'll do a video on probably the 2nd December on what I will be reading in December, because I'm still trying to work out what I'm going to read in December. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed that. Like, subscribe, comment, send me some Ko-Fi money if you're in that kind of mood, and I will speak to you all in December 2025, when I am 50 days away from being 55. I am an old man. And on that note, goodbye.